Good morning, and thank you for joining us for for the webinar "Working with Food Banks: Food Recovery Opportunities as a Conservation Practice." This webinar is presented by Capital RC&D with assistance from the Natural Resources Conservation Service, USDA NRCS. And today we have Rob Amsterdam from Feeding America. He'll give you a little overview of Feeding America and his position. I want to give you a little background about Capital RC&D. Capital RC&D serves 7 counties in South Central Pennsylvania, and we primarily work with private landowners and agriculture. And last year we developed a number of videos associated with on-farm composting and have sponsored 2 webinars that are, we feel, complements to those videos associated with food recovery that is usable food on farm. And today, that is why today we have Rob Amsterdam. Last week, we had a video concerning on-farm gleaning, and you'll find a copy of that video on or that webinar on our website. And before we begin the presentation, I just want to address a couple of things. First of all, we're using the Zoom webinar technology, and if you bring your cursor to the bottom of your screen, you'll see that you can ask questions, type in questions using the Q&A icon, and it'll pull up a screen that'll allow you to type in questions. We'll break one time in the middle of Rob's presentation for questions and answers, and also have Q&A at the end of the webinar. All participants are to the webinar are muted, and but please let me know if you have any questions or having any technical issues using the Q&A screen. And right now I'll turn it over to Rob Amsterdam. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Susan. Can you hear me? Can you unmute and let me know that you can?
I am unmuting, and yes, we can hear you.
Okay, all right, thank you. Well, thank you again, Susan, and thank you to Capital RC&D and NRCS for giving me and Feeding America this opportunity to talk to you, present this on how we work in partnership with growers to help mitigate food waste at the farm level, and look at opportunities to move usable food that is not often marketable into the charitable food network, which is what our work is all about. And you can see on our cover screen here that our goal is to solve hunger and hopefully end hunger. Solve hunger today and end hunger tomorrow. So again, thank you for this opportunity, and I also want to give a little bit of thanks to the 2 folks who made the presentation last week. I did watch that webinar, and they did an excellent job on gleaning opportunities. That's another part of the overall opportunity to move food into the charitable food network that is not otherwise marketable or usable at the farm level, but is still edible. And they do a wonderful job. It complements what we do. Our work is a little bit different, and I'm going to go through what we do. Just to give you a brief overview of Feeding America, we are a national network of 200 member food banks across the country, including Washington, D.C. and Puerto Rico. Our food banks cover every county in the country, and I'm not saying that we are the only food banks out there, but some of our food banks overlap with other non-Feeding America members, all of us with the same mission, which is to end hunger in America. So again, we're 200 member food banks. Our member food banks service approximately 60,000 agencies. And an agency is maybe a food pantry in your local church or at a community center or at a school, a backpack program at a school, a soup kitchen, and so on. Just to drill down a little bit further, since our audience is primarily in Pennsylvania, Pennsylvania hunger statistics, every year Feeding America does a research. We collect a lot of data from various sources, and we put together a project that we call Map the Meal Gap. And we look at every state and we drill down to the county level. In Pennsylvania, these statistics go back to, I believe, 2017 or 2018. 1.6 million people in Pennsylvania are at risk of hunger. Approximately 25% of those facing hunger in Pennsylvania are children. But that 1.6 reflects about 1 in 8 Pennsylvanians are at risk in Pennsylvania. And just to give you a little background on that, just step back a little bit. When we talk about food insecurity or hunger, there's several definitions just to go over briefly. Food security is access by all people at all times to enough food for an active, healthy life. Food insecurity is the USDA's measure of a lack of access at times to enough food for an active, healthy life for all household members, limited, et cetera. And then very low food insecurity would be food insecurity in the household that reaches levels of severity great enough that one or more households have reported multiple indications of reduced food intake. So these are kind of give you the spectrum of what we're talking about with respect to hunger and food insecurity. And another very interesting aspect about Pennsylvania hunger or food insecurity is approximately 24% of our population in Pennsylvania is 60 years old or older. And of those, of that 24%, approximately 16.5% of seniors are food insecure. Our network in Pennsylvania is comprised of 9 member food banks. The map on the screen right now shows you the different service territories that our members cover. So if we look at Central Pennsylvania Food Bank, it's in blue, and they cover basically from the Maryland border up to the New York border, and it's the central swath of the country. It's 27 counties. They are by far the largest food bank geographically in the state, but you can see that our other food banks range from pretty big regional coverage, like the Northwest, Second Harvest of Northwest Pennsylvania out of Erie, that's in purple, and then Greater Pittsburgh Community Food Bank in orange. But then you look at Philadelphia, and Philabundance in Philadelphia seems to have geographically a relatively small area, but they of course have the greatest population of individuals that they cover in their service territories. So here's a brief overview of how our food banks work. This was part of a presentation that Central Pennsylvania Food Bank made last year at the PASA conference. You know, it's a real nice overview. We collect food and donations from farmers. That's where I work. I'm on the produce team at Feeding America. But we also collect in our network from wholesalers, retailers. We have food drives with individuals. There's state and federal programs that provide either funds to go out and acquire food, or actually direct delivery food, like the Food Assistance Emergency Food Assistance Program, or TFAP, which the government will buy up, the federal government will buy up surplus food and then distribute that to the food banks for further distribution to individuals through their agencies. And of course, we are funded, and this is very important, keep in mind, we are primarily funded through private donations. That comes from corporate donations, foundations, and individuals who contribute money to our work at either the individual food bank level or at the national level. We are not underwritten by government funding. So that's that's a question that always comes up, but just to reinforce that it's really private funding that drives our work. Once the food gets into our food banks, the food is sorted. It's sometimes it's repacked. One thing that that we always like to remind folks that we have paid staff. I'm a paid staff member at Feeding America, but our work is really supported by an army of volunteers who come in, give their time, come into our food banks. They will help with repacking food or sorting food, or even receiving or loading trucks sometimes, and working at our distributions through our agencies. Once the food bank receives and sorts the food, it goes out programmatically to our partner agencies, and then those agencies distribute that to our neighbors in need. I've mentioned food banks and agencies, so just to kind of take a step back and revisit those terms, what is the difference between a food bank and, say, a food pantry, or a food bank and an agency? I like to describe a food bank, what we call food banks in our network, as kind of distribution centers. And then the agency, in a way, is almost like the retail end of that. That is where food is directly distributed to individuals in need. As far as a farm is concerned, or anyone else who's donating food to our work, there's several options. You can go directly from the farm to a food bank or to an agency. And this often just depends on volume. And of course, volume will drive logistics. So we don't like to turn away any offers of donations, but sometimes it doesn't make sense to transport something from a farm to a food bank that's a couple hours away, and it doesn't make sense from the trucking standpoint. But when we talk to farmers, we often will put them in touch with our food banks, and our food banks can direct them and organize a direct delivery to one of our agencies, either a pantry or a soup kitchen or some other program that can receive the product and utilize it regardless of the size. One other sort of, as we've grown our produce program at Feeding America, we've also set up several regional co-ops to serve our member food banks within a much larger footprint than, say, the state level. We are now, I think, finishing our third year of the MidAtlantic Regional Cooperative. That's comprised of 24 member food banks, of 24 Feeding America member food banks. It's located in the Philadelphia wholesale produce market. They rent space there, and they bring in produce. They break it down, and then they re-aggregate that and ship out mixer loads to 24 different food banks in the footprint. And that footprint goes from Maine to Virginia. Last year, they actually, this number is 2017, this number is for 2018. They distributed 25 million pounds of produce. That was their second year of operation. And they expect that number to hit close to 30 million pounds of produce for calendar year 2019. They're averaging now about 14 to 15 trailer loads going out every single week. So this is a great opportunity for growers who have truckload volume that we can bring it in, and then we can break that down and distribute that out in partial loads on a mixer to individual food banks who may not want a full load of any one item, but want a truckload of produce that would have multiple items on it. Just to show you on the map, here are the members that, as I said, as far north as Good Shepherd Food Bank in Auburn, Maine, all the way down to Virginia Peninsula, down in Virginia Beach. And these are the different food banks that are participating in the MARC. And that's 24 of our member food banks in this region. We actually have 42 members, Feeding America members in there. So we have a little bit of work to do to bring the other members in. So that was an overview of Feeding America Network and our work. I don't know if there are any questions, Susan, that you might have on that before I move into how we do our work.
Yes, one question came to mind, and that was, how does a producer identify their regional food bank? Do you have that information online at the Feeding America website?
We do. If you go to feedingamerica.org, you can scroll, you can look in the upper banner, and there's a section that says Find Your Food Bank. And if you click on that, it brings, there's a drop-down menu, and you can type in the state and then hit go, and that'll list all of the food banks in the state. And then you can click on those and find what your local food bank is. You can also go by zip code in there and find the same information if you want to get a little more specific.
And another point I'd like to make, I saw in your initial slide about hunger in Pennsylvania, I thought it was very interesting that 21% of rural Pennsylvanians experience some level of food insecurity. That's really interesting given the overlap of that is where farming is. So I just wanted to mention that from the perspective of feeding your neighbor.
Yes, it's it's something that we have known, and USDA has known for some time, that both food insecurity and poverty levels are more or less the same by percentage in rural and urban areas. And one of the initiatives that we have at Feeding America with our new CEO, Claire Babineau-Fontenot, has been to make a very concerted effort to address food insecurity in rural areas. And food insecurity in rural areas, in terms of our work, is often compounded by distances and lack of capacity at our food banks in those areas to basically serve the needs in those areas. So we at the national level are trying very hard to enable our member food banks to really work hard on mitigating hunger in rural areas.
That's great.
All right, so I will move on. And if there are any other questions, as Susan had mentioned earlier, you can click on the Q&A button and type those in. We'll try to answer them. So this is how we work. So one of the things we often will say to a farmer or others who may have food to donate, that we can be a business solution for you. Unsaleable produce due to grade defects and or market conditions are really, for us, opportunities, not necessarily, but sometimes a burden for a farmer. One of the things that we like to remind folks is that we can mitigate the cost of disposal, and oftentimes on a farm there's not a money cost to that. Oftentimes, I say, but sometimes there is. If there's packed product that the markets just can't use anymore, there's a labor cost to dump that product if you are able to compost it or spread it. And that's something that you may consider in terms of donating that product. I often work with importers And that's much more of a challenge for them because they actually have to pay out-of-pocket cash to dispose of product that they can't sell. But so that's how we present ourselves as a possible business solution. Of course, we love for people to donate to us just out of the goodness of their heart, but we know that there's a lot of other considerations. So when we look at donations from farmers, and I'm going to focus on farmers in this presentation, obviously a straight donation or a zero-cost donation is wonderful. We also look for what we call PPO, or a recovery cost of food to us, and I'll get into some details on that how that works. But there is a donation aspect to that, and another benefit that can come back to the donor is there's potential tax credits, and I will get into a little more detail on that in another slide. The important thing is that the standards that we look for are that the food, in this case produce, must be fit for human consumption. We really ask that there is minimal waste in either individual items or at the load level. So these would be condition issues versus grade issues for produce. We also will have, when there's an excessive amount of waste in an offer, we often can't accept that because we also will have at our food banks disposal costs, which are cash costs to basically dump product and have it hauled away. And it also takes up a lot of volunteer time. But that's not to say that we can't deal with some waste or condition issues. And that becomes pretty subjective and things that we work out with our individual donors. And everyone pretty much gets on the same page with that. But again, off-grade product is really value to us, and oftentimes a waste product at the farm. So one thing I always like to talk to when I'm talking to farmers is the difference between PPO, which is pick and pack out, or a recovery cost, versus a purchase. PPO is more or less a fixed cost. It's, you know how a grower knows what their costs are to grow, harvest, and pack a product. When we get a PPO donation, what we are saying to the grower, and this is important for tax credits, that the produce is considered to be donated. That's a sunken cost for a grower. Growers are typically not grading when they harvest food and harvest their produce in the field. But then when it comes onto the packing line, they are sorting what is marketable and what isn't marketable. And typically the unmarketable product is commingled with waste. So you may have cucumbers that are curved or showing a yellow belly, or shrunken tips or something like that, very shrunken tip that you can't sell to, the grower can't sell into the market, but it's still edible. And that's different than the cucumber that comes in that's broken or has started to break down or has some kind of disease that's moldy. So at that point, to sort those, the waste from the unmarketable incurs a labor cost. To put that into some kind of container that we can take into our food banks, whether it's a bin or a box, is another cost, the cost of that material. And then preparing that pallet or whatever for us to pick it up is yet another cost. So there's some labor, there's some packaging costs, and a few other costs involved in doing that. So when we talk about that, that's pretty much a fixed cost. That doesn't really vary with market conditions. And that's what the discussion we have with growers with regard to pick and pack out. And we can make those arrangements. And very often we've made some arrangements with growers where this becomes part of their business model for them. And what we say to them, if market conditions change and you can sell product that you would be otherwise be offering to us for donation, please go ahead and do it. We want you to make money. We want you to be sustainable. But our cost is our cost. The cost that we agreed on is our is the cost that we agreed on, and it doesn't vary with market conditions. On the other hand, an outright purchase would be market-based and would fluctuate with market conditions. This is especially true with fresh produce, where markets tend to be volatile and they tend to change on a rapidly throughout the season. So there are times where markets just get really backed up and growers have packed excess that they can't sell, and they will offer it to us at a very cheap price, and sometimes that's lower than the pick and pack out cost. And because we are always stretching our budgets as far as we can, sometimes we take advantage of those. But for the most part, when we talk to a grower, we're really, and there's any kind of money involved in the transaction, we're looking at a pick and pack out. But again, I will reiterate that we always love and always ask for zero cost donations, fully recognizing that that sometimes is something that a grower cannot afford to do. So again, going back to the standards, the quality must be fit for human consumption. There really should be minimal, there must be minimal waste of individual items. Sometimes this condition, it's an off grade. And you can see here the example that I have in this photo. These are actually apples. These are Granny Smith apples from New Zealand. There was some kind of post-harvest treatment that was missed or not properly applied to these apples. When they were grown, they came in, and there were a couple lots with this importer that had this superficial discoloration on the surface. These were absolutely unmarketable. Nobody would touch them, yet the apples were perfectly edible and just as tasty and crisp and as delicious as any Granny Smith would be. So this importer, for them, it was in their interest to donate these to us as opposed to paying disposal fees to dump them. One of the things that we have in Pennsylvania, a program that we have in Pennsylvania that is now, I believe it's in its 4th year, is called PASS. It's the Pennsylvania Agricultural Surplus System. These are funds that are they're in the budget, and they are appropriated through Pennsylvania Department of Agriculture, and they are for the charitable food network to use to purchase product from Pennsylvania producers. Most of the money up to now has been used to purchase produce, but it can also be used for dairy, protein items, and some other products that are more primarily produced here in Pennsylvania and food product. Currently, the funding for PASS is $1.5 million annually, and that goes through the Pennsylvania fiscal year from July 1st to June 30th. Every county receives PASS funding through the state food purchase program formula. In some cases, these funds are used by the county to purchase this. In most cases, it goes through Feeding America member food banks, but there are some other non-Feeding America food banks who also receive these funds to purchase directly from producers. It basically, as I said before, the funding covers cost to a farmer to purchase product from them, and it will cover the packaging. It will cover any value added that goes into, for example, we've worked out some arrangements with some dairy producers where loads of milk were donated. The milk itself was donated, but then the processing to convert it to cheese was what was paid for using PASS funds. And it also covers transportation to bring the product to the food banks. And the ask has been for $3 million, but so far the legislature has appropriated $1.5 million through the first 4 years of the program. And again, we continue to advocate to get that money increased. It's a great benefit for us. It's a win-win for farmers and for the charitable food network. It's great to be able to take some money and give it back to the ag community for supporting our work. Another incentive for growers is our federal tax incentives. In 2000, at the end of 2015 and going into effect in calendar year 2016, was the PATH Act. I don't really remember what PATH stands for. As you know, all legislation has a name to it. But basically what it did is expanded the federal tax incentives for produce donations, and really for all food donations. We just say produce because this is a little leave behind that we had for the produce team at Feeding America. But two really critical pieces were added to the federal tax code with the passing of the PATH Act. Obviously, food had to be donated to a nonprofit. That was always in existence. But prior to the PATH Act, only a C Corp was listed as part of the permanent tax credit. So there's very few farms that are C Corps, although there are some. And you had to be on, the donor had to be on accrual accounting. What the PATH Act changed into permanent code was that all business entities, and that would include S Corps, LLCs, partnerships, individual proprietors, etc., were eligible to take the tax credits, and they developed a formula for those entities that were on cash accounting. And I can, if you reach out to Susan, we can provide you with a two-pager that gives you an overview of that and an overview of how the tax credits work for cash accounting and accrual accounting. But as always, we say, before you do anything here, you must consult with your tax advisor to make sure you're within the law. But it is a great benefit for farmers if they choose to use it. The value of a tax credit versus a deduction is that the tax credit comes after you've determined your tax liability, and then the tax credit comes off the top at that point. So it is hopefully an incentive for growers and others to donate to the Charitable Food Network. And then lastly, and I think this always comes up, there's always a question of liability in donating. In 1996, President Clinton signed the Bill Emerson Good Samaritan Food Donation Act. And basically what that does is it frees the donor from liability with respect to food safety, provided, and this is the key word, words, that the donor has made their donation in good faith. In other words, they are, excuse me one second. This is my other phone coming in to me, and I have to figure out how to silence it while I'm on this call. Okay, sorry about that. Again, let me restate that on if the good faith effort has to be that the donor is making the donation fully aware that they are in compliance with any food safety laws, and they are doing this in good faith. And the idea is that they are giving good food, good edible food, and fit for human consumption into the Charitable Food Network. And in that case, they are not liable for what may happen after that. And as a footnote to that, our food banks, Feeding America food banks, do undergo an annual food safety audit by AIB, and that audit is all-encompassing, so they are required as part of that to do food safety oversight of all of their agencies. And we have the independent audit that's done by AIB to all of our food banks, and we have an internal team of compliance and capability that also provides ongoing guidance and support, as well as oversight and audits for food safety at our food banks. So with that, I've kind of come to the end of my presentation. again, I want to thank Susan and Capital RC&D and NRCS for supporting this, and the opportunity to tell you all a little bit about our work. And my contact information is here. Again, I'm Regional Produce Engagement Director for the eastern part of the US. That means I'm covering Maine to Florida. And I am part of the produce team in our supply chain channel. And I work with our food banks to continue to grow their produce distributions. Our goal is by 2025 to have what we refer to as foods to encourage. That would be fresh fruits and vegetables primarily, but other highly nutritious foods as the major part of the foods that we distribute to those of our neighbors in need. That's it. Susan, I'm handing it back to you.
Great. Well, thank you so much, Rob. This is a good overview. It was very interesting. I have two questions. The first is about the PASS funds.
Yes.
Now, those are controlled by the various food banks. Now, does PASS pay at a market set price, or does it pay some other way? I noticed you had how does the funding, what does the funding cover?
Yeah, so I can answer that. We we approach producers the same way we do even without the PASS funding. Again, this is something, while the PASS funding is nice, that's $1.5 million annually that gets distributed through our entire network, and it's to benefit at our end, to benefit all of those food insecure people in the US, or I'm sorry, in Pennsylvania. And as I stated before, we have to always stretch our money as far as we can. So we try not to purchase at market. We try to purchase at still utilizing the recovery cost basis for anything that we're purchasing through the program. And as I mentioned, one of the things that we were able to do was we were able to get fluid milk donated. So that donation went from, and then pay for the processing of that. So that was one utilization of it. With produce producers, fruit and vegetable growers, again, we're still talking to them at the PPO level, not market-based in terms of spending down PASS money. Did that answer that question?
I believe it did. Very good. Thank you. And I guess the final question is, if a producer wants to make a donation, then or to receive PPO, they would discuss this with their food bank after they identified that particular food bank? How would that process work?
Right, that's exactly how that would work. We, in my former role at Feeding America, I was a regional fresh produce sourcer, so I was actively seeking and prospecting for growers, but obviously there's a lot of growers, and they range from small to large. And so we, obviously an individual like myself can't identify everyone and contact them. And there are often growers who reach out to us. So one way or another, that's how we connect with growers. So if there are growers on this call or on this webinar who are listening and they've never spoken to anyone, go to the feedingamerica.org website and go to the Find Your Food Bank, type in your zip code or just type in Pennsylvania and see who's there, and contact the food bank, and they will put you in touch with somebody who is doing food sourcing at the food bank, and or they may put you back in touch with the person who is handling my work now, that I'm no longer the sourcer but doing something else.
Great. Well, thank you so much for all this great information, Rob. Again, we'll be posting the webinar on the Capital RC&D website. We will then be advertising the availability of the webinar, and we'll have a second showing of the webinar with live question and answer in late January or early February after we outreach again to producers. And meanwhile, thanks for those who attended today, and thank you again, Rob.
All right, thank you.